Welcome to this second plenary session in this very different annual conference of the Euromemo Group. I'm Jeremy Lehman. I'm a member of the steering committee and a retired emeritus fellow in European political economy at Loughborough University. We have been obliged to rethink the format of this plenary after the withdrawal of one of the keynote speakers, Leila Talani. And we've chosen to deploy two members of the steering committee as discussants of the two main presentations. So in consequence, we are very pleased that today's panel comprises four very experienced and respected scholars from Holland, Germany, Greece, and Italy to speak on the subject, which is key challenges for a socio-ecological transformation of the EU in the shadow of the twin crises of climate change and COVID-19. In order of their contributions, they are Joachim Spangenberg, Marcella Corsi, Murat Asel, and Marika Frangakis. The two keynote speakers will have 20 minutes each for their presentations, the discussants 5 to 10 minutes for their commentaries. And we therefore hope to have a generous amount of time for discussion between the panel and the rest of you and us as participants. Those who are participating as listeners or watchers should note the opportunities provided by Zoom to participate in the discussions via, first of all, the chat icon, which allows you to type short commentaries for the speakers and the audience's attention. Then there's the Q&A icon, which allows you to pose direct written questions to the speakers. And then the hand or the wave icon, or when you wish to participate, you raise your hand and you will then be selected to participate in the active discussion right at the end in the second half of the plenary. I wanted to say a couple of brief introductory words about this year's conference. It builds on last year's work on the Green New Deal, examining the challenges of a transformative transition to a sustainable and just political economy. But it's now set against the background of a global pandemic. It's noteworthy, I think, that progressive environmentalists and green economists have stressed the core relevance of this disruptive epidemic to debates over the climate crisis, and as a powerful argument against the fragmentation of global collaboration resulting from the most recent wave of nationalist populism. I think it's undeniable that COVID is a global phenomenon, as is the climate crisis, as is the structural crisis of capitalism. And this, above all, makes global collaboration fundamental to our survival and the welfare of our grandchildren. So I'm therefore very pleased to welcome in the first instance, Dr. Joachim Spangenberg from SERI, the Sustainable Europe Research Center, and also of the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research, who will talk, among other things, about the multiple crises afflicting Europe and the world, and the European Green Deal. Joachim.
Yeah, thank you very much for your friendly introduction. I hope you can see my presentation right now.
Yes.
And I will first run you briefly as a reminder through the status quo, which is something which is probably well known to everybody, so it can be rapid, before coming to some fake solutions which are proposed, what needs to be done, and then something about the European Green Deal. By the way, it's a pleasure to join you again after many years that I could not take part in the Euro Memo conference because of conflicting appointments. So it's nice to be with you. So first, the perfect storm, which you are well aware of. We know that we have for a sustainable transition to care for environmental, social, economic, and institutional elements, and currently all the imperatives on the 4 dimensions and their interlinkages are under stress. With the current development, we will definitely not be able to reach the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular because they have a strong emphasis on social aspects, which is not reflected in current policies. We see that the economic system is being undermined by tax evasion, which leaves little money for social transfers and the social security systems. We are confronted by an attack on biodiversity, which according to the planetary boundaries is even more serious than the climate crisis. The war against climate is going on. In some countries, pollution is considered a freedom. The global pollution, this is a plastic case. We see that metal and mineral extraction is growing almost unlimitedly, and that is for sure nothing which can be continued for a permanent development. We see that we have a kind of undermining of democracy in a number of countries where you would not expect that, and that people can be brought to do the government's biddings. The massive drain on resources from the military, which is absorbing money, resources, energy, and brains, and offers hierarchical thinking instilled into society. And that also inflicts, of course, the global economic and peace development. You see the countries which are affected here are all those which have high resources on oil, like Venezuela, Iran, and Iraq. So in that situation, we are given and offered fake solutions, and the fake solutions are to address the symptoms, but not the causes. So greening car mobility or adding some new renewable energies is nothing which will solve our problems in the end. I said that what we need is not only innovation, because we have too many things which are just plainly wrong. So we need exnovation. We have to get rid of certain things. It makes no sense to have good solutions on top of bad ones without eliminating the bad ones. Of course, efficiency, circular economy, and renewable resources offer a potential in reducing the pressures on the environment, maybe by a factor 4 to 5, but that is exactly what 3% growth will eliminate within 50 years. So within the growth paradigm, I think there is no real solution. That is a reminder of the IPCC scenarios. They all include an overshoot and a return to 1.5 degrees in the course of the 21st century, including also a massive switch from fossil to bio-based production without taking any kind of precaution against the loss of biodiversity, which is serious. This is from the latest IPCC report, an assessment of what the dire consequences of global warming will be. I have made a red frame around the one which is wildfire damage. You see in the gray line, it is where we are now. This is what is called moderate impacts. And if you see what we just seen in the news from California, if that is moderate impact, you can imagine what we are expecting to see in the future. The climate mitigation, which is proposed by the IPCC, is massively expanding the forest, reducing pasture lands, food crops, and energy crops. Energy crops are growing, but food crops are being reduced. That at the same time where we are facing a global demand for food, and we need pasture lands for biodiversity purposes. So that is the complete failure of climate economics, which is based on neoclassical economic thinking. So even we see that the media, like The Economist, are beginning to ridicule climate change and the need for adaptation, as you can see from these photos, which of course are intended to make the whole development look pretty irreal. What we are needing then is a significant reduction of resource consumption. If you look at the global trends we had from population and GDP to water use and transportation, there was all the massive acceleration over the last less than 50 years. And this trend cannot continue for environmental reasons as much as for resource scarcity, which implies that a return to the status quo is no option at all. It's simply not possible. If we go for a sustainable society, the assessments we made about the available material consumption and energy consumption, then we see that a sustainable society would be somewhere between a hunter and gatherer society and an agrarian society and material consumption, and between agrarian industrial societies in energy consumption. That means we have to significantly change course, and that means we must be serious about bending the trend, a very popular narrative these days, from always going up in all fields to going down. Policy promises are about stabilizing or reducing, but the question is it credible, is it feasible, and what sort of policies and knowledge is necessary for that? By the way, this slide is from the latest environmental report of the European Environment Agency, which shows very clearly that also amongst institutions like that, it is recognized that the trend cannot continue. The same holds true for the trend you see on the left-hand side in the slide of the global distribution of income. And then we have to ask ourselves the question, which level do we want to address? Do we want mitigation? Do we want to restore the functioning? At the moment in climate change, we are talking about adaptation. In the field of COVID-19, we are talking about restoration, but the issues of prevention are usually neglected because, for instance, it was a phase in the early COVID discussion that large-scale nature protection would be required to prevent future large-scale pandemics, but that obviously has disappeared from the discussion. So against this need for action, what do we think about the European Green Deal? I'm happy to go into details in the discussion section, but right here I only can give some more general remarks. What I consider the most positive element, the primacy of policy, begins to be restored at the European Commission. In particular, what we see is that under the previous Commission, whenever they wanted private investment, they first came up with public money and wanted that as a trigger to stimulate private investment. I think now they have recognized that strict regulations are one of the most effective tools you can have in mobilizing private money to make sure they have to invest, which is, I think, also from an economic point of view, good, because we have this unused capital which is not being invested and which is causing volatility in the capital and economic markets. So that would be very much welcome. However, any investment requires energy, materials, know-how, money, and working time. The latter is welcome in a time of threatening unemployment, But the former, the demand for material and energy, needs to be compensated by the measure itself over and above the contributions to climate, biodiversity, and pollution. This requires time limits for the measures to be set, monitoring and enforcement. Time limits are now part of what is in the Commission work plan. Monitoring and enforcement are traditionally very weak, and there is a significant need for improvement. So from my point of view, the European Green Deal is almost as far as you can get within the prevailing paradigm of growth and free trade. However, the real world has moved on. So it's time for the Commission, I think, and for the economists working with them to recognize that they are riding a dead horse. Because on the current situation, on the current concepts, you will not be able to think out of the box. What we have to be aware is that we need a substantial decoupling. We have the growing trend in GDP. We have relative decoupling in quite a number of countries, which is definitely unsustainable because it still increases the pressure on the environment. We have in a number of countries absolute decoupling. That is what the Green New Deal is about, but this is also unsustainable because it still transgresses the planetary boundaries, and it had also been only achieved in a limited number of countries which have very low growth rates. So what we need is an absolute degrowth, and when I say degrowth, I mean degrowth in physical terms, in energy and resource consumption terms, not in monetary terms. And that should lead to a steady state economy which might be potentially sustainable. Some of the points to show that the Commission assumptions which are still being used underpinning the policy strategies are outdated. One is that sinking feeling in the trade of goods. It has not only decreased or almost collapsed, as you can see on the right-hand side, after the COVID, but it was already shrinking beforehand. So the global free trade expansion has first come to a stagnation and then almost a standstill or even a retreat. We also see that free markets are no longer what is ruling the world relations. It is now a geopolitics, or some people call it neo-imperialism. We have power projection replacing deregulation, and we have spheres of influence replacing free markets. So that is the reality of international exchange. And we have to see that these kind of structures are based on political and military power. Just to quote Joseph Nye, the former chairman of the US, that they are underpinning this international trade system. So that is about trade. About the social dimension, I think the approach is too narrow in a sense that for the socio-ecological transformation, the carrying capacity of our societies is just as important as the carrying capacity of our ecosystems. And that is one of the weakest points of the European Green Deal. It also underestimates the complexity of the system, and in that sense is too shallow. So you have to integrate energy, mobility, and food system in the center, but with social values, knowledge, infrastructure, policies, technologies, and so forth to really reach a deep-rooted change. The approach is underestimating socioeconomic complexity. Just to give one example here, you would have to change the agricultural policy to restrict field sizes to 6 hectares per field if you want to safeguard biodiversity. That would have an impact which is significant on farmers' income, or it would have a significant impact on the price of food, basic commodities. Hence, biodiversity protection will require increased minimum salaries or a basic income to make it socially acceptable. So these complexities are completely underestimated by the Commission work. This is the different trends which are actively taking place in Europe at the moment. And what I want to point out is that they are all interconnected, and only few of these interconnections are taken into account in the European Green Deal. We in particular need to limit the size of what I call the put-put system. You know that this is our economy. If you have the input, you have a processing system, and you have the output, which is either waste or consumables. And the EU simply focusing on the Lisbon heritage of growing economies denies the necessity to significantly reduce the physical size of the economy and its throughputs, while there are concepts to kickstart business sectors and other entertainments. There is no concept so far how to limit the size of the economic procedures. That is something which never has been tried, and it will be essential if we really want to make sure that as the energy as well as the biodiversity can be safeguarded for the future.
Joachim, 2 minutes, please.
Perfect. The next point is that the approach from my point of view is two statist, which means that the state is the only actor which is really taken into account. Civil society and its organizations, which is exactly those who produce the pressure motivating the EU, and the consumers as large play only a negligible role in the European Green Deal. It's very much focused on the heritage from the supply side thinking, and the demand side management does not play a role. However, without consumption changes, the Paris Accords targets are out of reach. And there are enough examples in the literature to show that there is a potential of the same dimension, but that is not being mobilized due to the supply side heritage and the economic thinking in the Commission. The role of trade union remains marginal at best. Environmental development NGOs play no role. Consumer organizations, the rest of civil society are not mentioned as agents. So the problem that we have with the approach is silent about winners and losers. And you know that winners and losers are both inevitable when you come to implementing such a strategy. So what is needed, it's the last two slides now. This is a slide again from the report of the European Environment Agency, which distinguishes between two unsustainable solutions. The writing in red is what I added, but they talk about system optimization, which has rather immediate effects, but is more or less a business as usual in the European Union and will not reach significant improvements. A partial system design starts a bit slower, but can be accelerated, but leads to significant higher improvements, but not sufficient ones. And what we need is a system innovation, a completely new system, which will take time to get started, but is the only way to escape the unsustainability trap, according to the European Environment Agency, which I think is a reference which we can use anytime. So in conclusion, the European Green Deal is no solution, but from my point of view, it may buy the time needed to have one, but only if the social pillar is strengthened, which is in my point of view, 2 weeks so far. So the cartoon shows you that the groups which are going to the left on their bike to the green future is a rather small minority, whereas truth and beauty is where people should go to. But the elections we had last Sunday in my hometown, where the Green Party was for the first time the strongest party in the local parliament, followed by the Social Democrats, with the Christian Democrat a poor third. I think there may be changes in the electorate which make such a transition possible, because I'm always optimist. Thank you very much for your attention. It was a bit too long, but that I think mainly due to the technical problems.
Thank you very much. Right, can I call on Marcella to respond. Marcella Corsi is Professor of Economics at Sapienza University in Rome and a member of the steering committee of the Euro Memo Group, and much valued. So thank you, Marcella. Would you like to respond?
Of course, yes. Well, as you have seen, despite all the technical problems, Joachim has presented a very, very rich presentation of the problem. So obviously, I have to concentrate on just some aspects of it, because otherwise I would speak maybe 2 hours, and instead I have just 10 minutes. So I concentrate mostly on the social aspects, of course, which are much more related to my work, to my research, to my activism as well. Let me start somehow with a sort of provocation. I show you this book, if you can read it. The title is "Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner?" So, because actually Joachim was very clear, in order to come out of the actual crisis, of the general capitalism challenges that we're facing nowadays, because obviously COVID-19 is just one of them, we have to find a new paradigm. I'm definitely working for that together with the other Euromemo steering group people since a long time ago. So what I want to say, well, in order to define a different paradigm and to face the challenge in terms also of care of our planet, of care of our system in a new way, in a progressive way, in a more inclusive way, from a social point of view, we have to find the right actors with whom to play this game. So I'm definitely in favor of a bottom-up approach, probably because I'm an old activist, still linked to this idea that revolutions not only are possible, but should be somehow proposed as a solution to our problems. So my revolution is a feminist revolution. For those of you who know me, definitely know that I've been fighting for this type of revolution since the time I was very young. So what means all this referring to Joachim's presentation? So it means, first of all, to define a privileged actor with whom to play. And this actor is the household. Since we have to start from the bottom, we have to start identifying who might be the persons activated in order to fight for this new paradigm, for this new Green New Deal, because we are talking about a new Green New Deal. And as a matter of fact, this is something that you will find also during our program in a panel that I will share about a feminist Green New Deal. So what means to look for the household? And that's why actually I was proposing this title somehow for my presentation, for my discussion. Well, it means to challenge, to fight all the inequalities that start within the household and then become, of course, the source of problems, not only for health crisis, but generally speaking for sustainability in the large definition that Joachim was proposing. And to be pragmatic, I just make 2 examples. So in the Green New Deal, in the European Green New Deal, basically European countries want households in terms of climate efficiency to become more energy efficient, to embrace sustainable practices like conserving water and recycling waste. This is, of course, absolutely consistent with the SDGs. I'm not going into the SDGs, of course, but I rely on your knowledge of the SDGs that, by the way, Joachim has mentioned. If we embrace a different point of view, so what I could call an ecofeminism point of view or ecofeminist economics, by contrast, we should recognize that households' climate relevance goes beyond energy efficiency. And particularly concentrating on the title, on the provocation that I did before, we should start considering the unpaid labor and the domestic labor, which is overwhelmingly performed by women, as you all know, and these are statistics, that not only perpetuate the gender inequality that we might fight against in order to find a new paradigm more inclusive and more equal, but they are also a free subsidy that help to propel a sort of economic growth and thus, of course, also the use of resources by rich countries according to the standard paradigm. Vice versa, or by contrast, if you like, we should facilitate a different consumer culture. For example, Joachim was mentioning not only the recycling, but the circular economies and so on. And certainly during these days that we spend together, we will come back to this issue several times. Because otherwise, if we want just to use the same paradigm once again, even if under a green label, what we will achieve is that just to have once again consumer standards and consumer habits that have already shown to have exceeded the planet biophysical limits. So this was basically the first example I wanted to make. So basically to concentrate on households, the inequality within the household, not only in order to privilege households and the members of the households, women and men, young people, old people, and so on, and diversity as an issue, but also to address, and this is the second point, and then I stop, Jeremy, control my time, of course. I hope I'm still in line with your decisions. So the second example I wanted to make concerns the type of analysis, and this is really relevant for us as a group, that we want to make in terms of impact. So once again, if we want to consider a sort of feminist new paradigm, then we have to be aware of the fact that policies have a gender impact that is usually ignored. This is something that has been mentioned also by Maria Caramessini in the first plenary. So somehow I connect my discussion also to her presentation, to her excellent presentation. So in that sense, what I mean by impact, gender impact, and ecofeminism is quite clear with an example. We all aware that to tackle global warming and social equality simultaneously, policymakers should have to address the gender outcomes of each individual policy. This is even from a methodological point of view possible through specific methodologies just like the gender budgeting methodologies. But apart from that, let's consider a specific policy that might be relevant in that sense. So converting from cars to public transports, bicycles, and walking, incentivizing walking, as it was done also for health reasons recently, might sound like a good idea. Who would not agree with this type of solution? But there is a but from a gender perspective, because this might also increase shifting into these different type of public transports or different type of transports or means of transportation would also increase the time and labor involved, for example, in shopping for food and other family necessities. If I can take my car to go to the supermarket and buy food, if I have to do it on foot, or if I have to go by bicycle, obviously this changes my use of time. This is something that is usually ignored. Yes, Jeremy. But unfortunately, this has a very big impact on especially women's life, the one who cooked the dinner for Adam Smith. So in that sense, green policies in our view, because fortunately I'm not the only one to think so, need to be crafted in a way that promotes gender equality rather than just increasing women's share of work and responsibility. As, by the way, has been done during the COVID-19 crisis, as Maria has rightly mentioned in the first plenary, because most of the burden of health and care work has been done once again by women, not only in the households, but in the health sectors and so on. So please think about that. And if you want, join us in the panel on the 23rd of September. I hope it was clear what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Marcella. We've had a couple of questions that have been raised on the chat and the Q&A facility. I would propose that they be put at the end of the first half, at the beginning of the second half discussion. So I would quite like now to go on straight away to the second keynote speak by Professor Murat Azel. Murat is Professor of Political Economy of Sustainable Development at the International Institute of Social Studies at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. He also chairs the editorial board of the journal Development and Change. He will be talking about climate crisis, capitalism and change. Who is the enemy? Murat, thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks everyone for inviting me. I'm delighted. It's the first time I get the opportunity to join this conference. I'm very happy to do so. And I'm happy to go second on the list because by fortuitous coincidence, I think Joachim's and my presentations kind of follow each other, except I also try to provoke by challenging some of the emerging conclusions from his talk. Hopefully we can have a discussion at the end. And so as I was listening to him, I actually changed my presentation. This is the problem with just-in-time delivery of goods. So I kept on moving my slides around, trying to anticipate how to build my argument. So let me just get into it. I'll do share screen. One, possibly the only good thing about this COVID, presenting under COVID conditions, is that I find myself talking much less when I'm speaking on Zoom than in person. So this shouldn't be a problem to keep to 20 minutes. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, I'm slightly wary of going to full screen, but let's see if I will have the same problem as before. Let me just jump into it. So I want to speak a little bit about my earlier work. I've moved from economics to human geography to political economy to various other things. Some of my earlier research was about risk politics, doing a lot of reading around Ulrich Beck's work. And over the years, so I've been looking at societal responses to various high technology, high uncertainty, high risk issues such as nuclear power, the mad cow disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, genetically modified foods, climate change, and of course now COVID-19. I'm beginning to write about the parallels between the two, COVID and climate change. And one thing that I've been sort of reading and writing about climate change for quite a few years, more than 20 years now, I think. And one thing that is beginning to be quite remarkable to me, and this might not everyone would agree with this perhaps, is that climate change, especially in Europe, but not just in Europe, has been substantially mainstreamed, and that the earlier debates about whether it is real, whether if it's taking place, are no longer actually being had. I think we've moved to a point where most sensible people, and you can see from my bullet that not everyone is sensible enough, but most sensible people concede the point that climate change is real and something It's not clear what that is, but something has to be done. And that there is general acceptance. And you can talk to farmers in Ghana, you can talk to indigenous people in the Ecuadorian Amazon, you can talk to Dutch people going on sunny holidays in Spain. They have all heard of, experienced the idea of climate change, and no one is quite bold or crazy enough, except for Trump, but there's a reason for that, to say that, you know, this is not something we need to worry about. So this is my starting point. The climate change, the crisis of climate change in some ways has been remarkably well accepted as a reality and as something that requires a reasonably urgent response. And I think the previous presentation did several times mention that, you know, the EU has all sorts of policies, European Green Deal, European Environment Agency producing all these reports, European NGOs of various types, left, right, and center, recognizing, even Shell is talking about climate change. Everyone is recognizing that there's something that that cannot any longer be ignored. So the question is, what do we do? What needs to be done? And in response to that, I'm seeing two sort of major intellectual projects, if I can call them that, emerging. One, more from the side of business and bureaucracy, which deals with the idea of circular economy, which is all the rage, obviously, within the European Union. And the European Union is spending so much money funding research projects, and now I'm taking some of that money myself, trying to essentially discover what it is. I mean, someone put the idea on the table that we have to have circular economy. It's not quite clear what it means in practice, but a lot of ink is being spilled on trying to explain it to each other. So there's that. And then there's the movement of degrowth, which 10 years ago perhaps was relatively marginal, but it's beginning to be mainstream quite a bit. Let me speak a little bit more about each one. Obviously, circular economy, and my slides are also not being, circular economy, this definition by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, I think it has become classic, is one that is regenerative by design and aims to keep products and components and materials at the highest utility and value at all times, distinguishing between technical and biological cycles. This new economic model seeks to ultimately decouple global economic development from finite resource consumption. Now, this is not necessarily a new idea. A previous version of this was in cradle to grave design. Before then, Dutch sociologists had done quite a bit to, express the same sentiment under ecological modernization. If you go further back, Marxist sociologists like Alan Schneiberg had written about the treadmill of production. All these essentially point to the necessity, which circular economy tries to capture again, of delinking economic growth from resource use. The idea is not to give up on growth, but to somehow split it from its environmental impacts. Again, it's not clear what this looks like, but this has become almost like accepted dogma in certain parts of Brussels at the very least, and businesses are perfectly happy to go along with it. Degrowth, on the other hand, comes from the margins. It was first and foremost a European idea meant for European societies. I think over the years, as ideas gain strength and popularity, whoever comes up with the idea feels the need to test its global legitimacy. So degrowth has gone global, but at its heart, I think it's a European project. And its main argument is that it is possible to realize more equal societies that use fewer resources. To not belabor the point too much, the idea here is to create delinking of well-being from resource use. So in a way, you can take both of these together, circular economy and degrowth. One hopes to delink growth from resource use. The other one hopes to delink well-being from resource use. Now, what do we do with these ideas within the context of climate change? I think within the context of climate change, the fundamental sort of like stylized fact we have to recognize is what Fussell called as double inequality. Those who are least responsible for creating climate change are also the ones who are most vulnerable and least resilient to its effects. So some of us, and I have to count myself among them, are continuing to fly around the world, live in relatively comfortable housing in the Netherlands, and consume imported products. I'm not Dutch myself, so a lot of the foods I like don't come from here. Not much food comes from the Netherlands, except for those things that are grown in greenhouses that are powered by natural gas. So those of us who are driving this process are the ones who are least affected. Again, the Netherlands is building some of the most ambitious sea defenses for when the seas rise, whereas those whose resources we consume in developing countries and elsewhere are going to be the ones who are going to experience the worst impacts of climate change and sea level rise and all the other problems. So, and this double inequality is true both between nation states, but also between classes, which is something that's less well discussed in the literature. Just as a quick demonstration of this, this is accumulated emissions in around the world in the last 250 years or so. Of course, the United States jumps out as the single biggest sinner in this. But if you add up the constituents of the European Union, I think the European Union's impact over the last 250 years isn't much to be proud of either. As with most things, US ends up making Europe look good, better than US, but European record is hardly anything to be celebrated. So at the level of countries, there's definitely a north-south divide, even if we factor China's recent explosion in emissions. If you look at per capita emissions, obviously the picture is also quite dramatic. Per capita US citizen emits about 8 times as much as per capita Indian national. And I think if you go around the world, these numbers are quite dramatic. I think there are a few countries in the Gulf and Saudi Arabia where the per capita emissions would be higher than the US. But the fact of this is that this is a problem being caused by the elite, the affluent. Of course, the richest 10% control 50% of the emissions, but the rest of us are not looking too good either. So what am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say so far is that there is a need to de-link resource consumption and de-link the idea of well-being from increased consumption of the goods that come out of resource consumption. And that's obviously going to require certain number of transformations in what we produce, how we produce, where we produce, and quite a few related discussions. And that this type of discussion has to be had, and this type of transformation needs to be brought forward and done so quickly is becoming essentially unavoidable. The question that is not being answered, the question that's not being answered, and here I don't have much time to get into it, but you know, I'm preparing a few separate pieces on this. The question that's not being discussed is the political process. As much as we're gathering here as European economists, the question is actually a political one. What type of political processes can deliver us either or both of these outcomes? How do we actually get from saying that we have a climate crisis and that it's urgent and that we need to have circular economy or degrowth is not much evidence of success. We need to actually see how we put this into practice? And in answering this question, how do we get there? I think we have to ask a number of very difficult questions. One of them being, what are the implications for structural transformation in developing economies? If we're going to, as a very popular idea says, leave oil in the soil and not extract any more oil in tropical areas, for example, to protect indigenous people, how will countries like Ecuador, how will countries like Indonesia actually create a different economy in which they can provide material improvement in the well-being of their citizens? If we're not going to consume their resources, how will they grow, or how will they develop? How will they increase their well-being? And how will they actually get to the type of economic structure? Clearly, the current mode of production in tropical countries, Ecuador is one I'm familiar with, is simply not prepared to a moment when we decide to degrow or delink. And at a more global level, the question is, what are the implications for labor? If we're going to change the way we're producing, the way we're consuming, what will that mean for workforce in Europe and beyond? Now, these questions are not being asked, these are not being asked seriously or loudly enough. Instead, we're getting statements like this. This is a quote from Ban Ki-moon. I think it's 2009. It could have been from yesterday. You can replace flu with COVID-19, and the sentiment is the same. This is a unique moment in world affairs, multiple crises, food, fuel, financial crises, flu are hitting at once. Climate change looms larger every day. Each illustrates a 21st century truth. We share one planet, one home. As people, as nations, as species, we sink or swim together. The basic argument, and the argument that also circular economy and degrowth literatures are not confronting, is that the assumption is that somehow the necessary socio-ecological transformations will just happen without conflict, without struggle, that somehow the obviousness of the crises, COVID is an obvious crisis, climate change is an obvious crisis, will compel us to act together. Yeah, and I think this is a fundamentally flawed idea, both politically, but also, I don't want to sound like the Irish Taoiseach who said, I know it works in practice, but does it work in theory? It doesn't work in practice, and it doesn't work in theory either. Societal transformations have never taken place without an enemy. It is not possible to, I'm asking these as questions, but since I'm running, I see the paper being shuffled, so I think I'm going to get a 2-minute warning in a second. Instead of just making these rhetorical questions, let me make them more provocative statements. It is not possible to have a struggle where there are no sides. It is not possible to have political economic transformation without antagonism. We need to develop a movement where there's a clear opposition to this. Right now, the way the ideas of degrowth, the way ideas of circular economy or sustainable development goals for that matter, assume somehow that the obviousness of the need for change will bring about the necessary transformation. That to me, politically as well as theoretically, is a non-starter. What does it mean theoretically, at least? Politically, politically, I can say very quickly that our failure to answer the question, what are the implications of dealing with climate change for labor, for example, is making it very easy for authoritarian leaders like Trump, like Bolsonaro, like Erdogan, to actually promise people what they shouldn't deliver because we are not able to offer them an alternative. If you tell people that sustainable consumption requires the abandoning of coal mining, there are thousands of Turkish farmers who have already lost their fields to neoliberal restructuring, and the only jobs they have now are in coal mines. If you tell them that that's going to go as well, they will vote for Erdogan, and they have been voting for Erdogan. So politically, not dealing with the question of how do we transform and what are the implications for labor and for distribution explains to a large extent why seemingly crazy authoritarian leaders keep winning elections every time. And if we don't answer this, Trump is going to win the next election. Since I'm in a provocative mode, I think we shouldn't discount that possibility either. Theoretically, the question of if something that needs to be done, who is going to do it, remains also unsolved. James O'Connor, in his classic piece on the second contradiction of capitalism, had said, the combination of crisis-stricken capitalism, externalizing more costs, the reckless use of technology and nature for value realization, and the like must sooner or later lead to a rebellion of nature, that is, to powerful social movements demanding an end to ecological exploitation. The question is, who are these powerful social movements that will bring this about? Jumping one slide, again, the great Joan Martinez Alier said, I think rightly, that environmental conflicts around climate change, but you can also extend this to COVID if you want. These new conflicts do not always correspond to fights between workers and capitalists, who are the protagonists of what James O'Connor called the second contradiction of capitalism. We don't know, partly because the protagonists haven't quite coalesced into a proper movement, and partly because the work of organizing them hasn't been done, and partly because we're assuming that the urgency and the reality of climate crisis and all the other environmental crises somehow will create a necessary political consciousness. But in reality, as you look around the election results in Brazil, in the US, in Ecuador, in Turkey, in the Philippines, you realize that the groundwork for this contradiction to actually take life, to take body, hasn't been done. Let me leave it there.
Thank you very much. Can you remove your presentation from the screen? Thank you very much indeed. Do we have Marika on board yet? I can't see her on the screen.
She's on my screen.
I'm here, Jeremy.
There. Hello. Right. You're not on my screen, Marika.
I don't know why. Jonas,
You are now. You are now. That's fantastic. Okay. We'll reserve the chat proposals and the question that have been raised so far for the period after the introductory presentation. So could I ask you, Marika, to comment on the last presentation and to give a few thoughts of your own? Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. I will not be able to comment on the very sort of exciting presentation of Murat, only because one of the reasons is that I've only just watched it, been able to watch it. I wasn't aware of it beforehand. Also, I come from a different environment. I come from the financial world. I've been the black sheep of finance for many years now, so I'm used to it. And given that, I shall concentrate on a few what I might call more pragmatic elements, which do either confirm or challenge some of the ideas that the previous two, or the keynote speakers have been putting forward. One idea that I heard was that the climate change, and forgive me if I say this not completely keeping to what was said earlier, the climate change is being mainstreamed. That is, the acceptance of the need for dramatic socio-ecological transformation is being being widened, broadened. May I say that in finance that is not quite the case, which has a number of negative repercussions. And on the other hand, I also heard that the socio-ecological transformation is a political process, and I thoroughly agree with that. And again, you can see the lack of a political process or the perseverance of the old political process in terms of climate change not being sort of incorporated into the way finance works. Again, you can see it there. So it is a political process, but it's It has not been mainstreamed. It is not in the part of the way finance works, contemporary finance works, and therefore that puts into question some of the things that we've been saying on the ground, on how things work on the ground from day to day and going forward. One thought, I don't know if anyone, I mean, we probably all know what a black swan is, right? A black swan is an event that is unexpected, it is rare, it has a wide-ranging or extreme impact, and we can only explain it after it has happened. Now, think of a green swan. A green swan, it is because there is uncertainty regarding the timing and the nature of the impact of climate change, because a climate catastrophe is worse than a financial crisis, and because it is particularly complex. Climate change has a very high order of complexity in terms of chain reactions and unpredictability. Now, I don't want to scare you, but this is what we're talking about. We're talking about climate change as a green swan, something that can engulf the world. We saw some graphs with colors starting from yellowish and going to dark mauve in Joachim's presentation. So this is what we're dealing with, basically. And although it is more and more in the literature, and in that sense it is becoming mainstream, if you turn to the financial world, then you have a financial conundrum. And the thing is, I know and I agree with Joachim that the European Green Deal puts forward, for example, a fund of 100 million, the Just Transition Fund, which is to be leveraged with private financing. Now, private financing is a fact of life, so one is not to sort of reject it out of hand. However, one is to demand that it is regulated, it is monitored, it is supervised. Now, if we go to the way climate change is incorporated in finance, we'll find that what we're talking about, and taking into account what I just said about swans, the green swan, we realize that basically we're talking about climate change risk. And climate change risk is, from the point of view of being regulated and so forth, it is not, right? The central banks have only just, and regulators have only just started discussing how to incorporate climate change risk in their framework, regulatory framework, monitoring framework for the private financial sector. So on the one hand, central banks are only now spending time on this, realizing, accepting that this is a very serious area, that a lot more needs to be done. On the other hand, when it comes to private finance, one finds that, well, there's a very small fraction of large financial institutions that have started thinking along the lines of environment risk analysis. Now, private financial institutions do carry out risk analysis. They look at number of risks and they measure them, and then they adopt their own policies accordingly. Now, the way they do that is by looking back. They extrapolate what they already know in terms of interpreting the present and the future. Now, you cannot do that with a green swan. You cannot do that with something that you don't know, or you don't know enough about, or you have not devised the way to interpret it, the way to have your data, to collect your data, and how to go forward. So this is the financial conundrum. On the one hand, you have something which is imminent, which is mainstream in the sense that people are aware of it. COVID, one of the benefits of COVID is that it has made everyone aware of the risks, of the dangers of climate change and what that means in terms of actually surviving. On the one hand, therefore, we're all aware of this, but on the other hand, the means to deal with it, I'm afraid to say, are not there yet. So yes, we may end up with this kind of, in fact, there is an, Morat said, ontological absence of an enemy. the fact that the banks and the financial system has not realized, has not incorporated the way to deal with this in their own framework means that either they have underestimated, they don't see an enemy, they in their arrogance or ignorance, as Joachim said, they have not turned to this kind of new element in the way they work. Or when they do realize it, one could argue even that they are the enemy because, you know, they're not actually adapting. But this is taking it too far, and I would not like to go into this sort of argument. What I see is a state of affairs, a state of in the financial world, where the climate change and what that means is, I'm afraid, not in the main agenda, not in the agenda of what's happening, or if it is, and the central banks, I must be fair, there is a push by the central banks. They have set up the network for the greening of the financial system. That was done in the past few years. And one of the, if you like, positive elements is that the political process is entering into the discussion of the central bankers and the regulators. They're realizing that financial stability and climate stability go together. They are interconnected, and therefore they have to take account of both. And they're also realizing that the short term, the here and now, is simply not enough. So the long-termism is also entering into their frame of mind. These are openings. I mean, we economists have criticized the central banks, especially the European Central Bank, for having a very narrow mandate. Well, this seems to be broadening right now, and this is one of the, if you like, positive elements that's happening in this area. However, going back to my starting statement, we do have a very sort of disquieting situation in terms of climate change on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have this financial conundrum with private finance. I spent enough, yes, thank you, I'll do that, I'll finish in a minute. And of course, I've been talking about private finance. Basically, one needs massive public investment, one needs tax reform so that we get more tax justice. However, until those things go forward, and I will agree with everything the previous speakers said in terms of mobilizing, of debate, of going forward in sort of strong sense. However, until that happens, there are institutions that need also to broaden their outlook to take account of what's happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Marika. Right. We have got a number of questions that have been raised, some specifically to Joachim, another one to Marcella, a hand raised by Joachim himself, but Joachim will get a chance to respond immediately to Marcella's intervention and to any other questions that may arise. How do we want to deal with this? Joachim, would you like to respond in the first instance to Marcella's general comments and on other things that have been said in the course of this debate?
Yeah. So first of all, Marcella, thank you very much for bringing up the issue of households. I've been working a number of years in the role of household consumption and gender issues. So it was a missing point. So I'm happy you mentioned that, and I fully agree. I also thank Marcia for putting the financial system on the table, because that is also a key element. And what I see, and that is for me quite an interesting new situation, that having been an activist for the last 40 years, we have been always fighting for getting some policy targets officially mainstreamed and endorsed. In the last 5 to 8 years, we have won this kind of battles. Most of the policy targets we had are now endorsed. The United Nations has decided on the social protection floor. General Assembly has promoted that. The SDGs have a lot of social and distributional justice issue. We have the Paris Agreement on climate, and we have the Aichi targets on biodiversity. However, what we do not have is a change in policies. What we have is we have different declared mainstream targets or objectives, but the instruments and the policies and the strategies have not been changed to reach these new kind of officially mainstreamed objectives. So that is a big discrepancy. And that is why I've been arguing with civil society groups that our main task is now shifting from calling for additional targets and minor adjustments to making sure that these targets are really the basis of policy planning, which requires a different policy planning, which is a different way of working. And my fear is that most decision makers I meet are pretty much aware that what they do is not sufficient to reach what they recognize needs to be reached. So that is what we call a cognitive dissonance. And the cognitive dissonance usually is not a very stable situation. So in this situation, you have either to give up on the targets which have been emerging over a long process, and that usually happens only in the context of an authoritarian government, because they can ignore the public mood, or you have to really start the transformation. And so I think at the moment we're at a very critical point of view, a point of time where we can tip the balance in the one or the other direction. And I see a big risk of more authoritarian governments, more fascism coming up and things like that. And I think for me, the US and the UK are just on the way to post-democratic countries. So that is a really frightening situation. One element which has been mentioned as a deficit is that there are no answers or no suggestions. I think just as much as it is important to come with new answers, it is also to point to the underlying assumptions which were causing the failure of the current strategies. And if you look at what we have heard, when you talk not only about sort of households, but in addition to that, about neighborhoods and local communities, which was so important in the COVID crisis, as everybody knows, that is exactly the contradiction to any reliance on the methodological individualism. When you look at the need for the great transition, we all talk about that. This is exactly what you cannot have in an equilibrium situation. Equilibria are not transitional. If you look at the question, what is the definition of a good life? What is utility well-being for the future? This is something different than utility maximization. So I think in the current situation, it has hardly ever been as obvious that all basic assumptions of neoclassical economics are just rubbish. And I think we have to point that out very clearly, because do not trust in people who are detached from reality. They haven't predicted the last crisis, they have no concept in this crisis, they will run you into the next crisis. And even if we only have building blocks and not a complete theory, that's all the time better than having a perfect theory which directs you into the completely wrong direction. So I think this kind of criticism at the moment is important to undermine the credibility of those advisors in high-paid jobs which still continue to preach the same kind of gospel. Also using things like Max Neef and his distinction of needs and satisfiers to put the consumption theory on a more realistic basis and many things like that. So that is, I think, a very important task we have at the moment. To the question I was asked, the question was some key aspects of the system innovation which I was talking about. So just give you two examples. One example we have is I'm advocating a kind of a cap, a physical cap on resource use for the European Union. And that would mean if the cap should be decreasing year by year, like it was foreseen for the CO2 on the emission and exit side, it should be on the input side to reduce resource consumption of Europe. If a company suddenly after 6 months runs out of resources, bad luck to them. So that simply means that one of the key determinants of future economic development would be resource efficiency and reduced resource consumption. So it would change the logic of allocation. Of course, the resources have to be allocated somehow to the different interested parties. We must make sure that public services and civil society get a share which is independent from these kind of economic distribution mechanisms, but that would change the way that the logic of working and accumulation is proceeding. Second thing is the basic social security, social income, which must also go hand in hand with improved primary distribution, because not only transfers. And thirdly, I expect, because you can distribute every year only what has been produced in that year as a surplus. And that means if we want to make sure that the economy doesn't grow, but maybe even shrink in physical terms, that may well lead to decreasing overall availability of money, a surplus. And that will be distributed between capital, labor, and the public hands, whether it's local or national. And if that is, if salaries are not increasing in the long run because the economy isn't growing, you can redistribute capital from the capital side only once. It's not a permanent process. It must be generated every year. So that means there will be massive distributional conflicts between capital, labor, and the public hand. And we need more money in the public hand to make sure that even if the incomes are not increasing, we have service offers which are part of a commoning strategy, which would help people to get the necessary services and quality of life without everything being private property. So you see, I'm attacking a number of very holy cows. And the last sentence on that, because it's important, I think. We have been working on degrowth for the last 10 years, and one of the key elements was always distributional issues, social security, and the labor market. So I think that has been the key issue from the outset. And in my activist life, I'm a board member of Friends of the Earth Germany, with an organization with some 600,000 members. And we are not extending our working field into labor market policies, but there is permanent discussions since about half a year between social sector organizations, trade unions, and environmental organizations about joint action, the overlap, and the sharing of tasks. And I think when you ask for what is a new movement, I think the coalition is a new movement. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, I wonder if Murat would like to respond to anything that has been said, particularly by Marika in her presentation. The one thing I wanted to tag on to Marika's observations was the question of the compatibility of a meaningful Green New Deal with capitalism. To what degree can we expect to achieve a green transformation, a meaningful green transformation under the auspices of capitalism? So, but I'll let you respond in a general sense, Murat. Thank you.
Just a very brief response that when I say, I don't think we disagree too much. When I say the idea that climate change is real and it's urgent has been mainstreamed, I don't mean in practice. It's been mainstreamed in discourse, in policy documents, in declarations, in a report written by Lord Stern. But in practice, obviously, I mean, that's a problem. In practice, things don't change. But in discourse, there's a lot of lip service that this is real. And it's that disconnect that we need to somehow overcome. And about the growth and all that, just quickly, I mean, of course, the issue of redistribution is there, but not again as a political project. I think politically, the idea seems to be, and I don't want to derail this discussion too much, the idea seems to be that in appealing to people's good sense would achieve the necessary transformation. And I'm not too optimistic that that's how change comes about. But anyway, this is a separate discussion from our main agenda, I think. I'll leave it there now.
Can I just add another one? I mean, to what extent do all four of you think that the COVID crisis has a huge... sorry.
Before you go on, can I just say one thing? Extending the idea of what I call the financial conundrum, in other words, the fact that, for example, we have 100 billion being provided by the European Union, and this will supposedly leverage private investment and private finance. Now, will this bring about a greening of, will this be able to deal with the climate change that, and you said, can we do this? Will it work under capitalism? I shall narrow the question down, let alone capitalism. My problem is that the 100 billion, which is supposed to leverage private finance, since private finance is so very much behind in terms of incorporating a proper analysis for the environment and climate change into the way the money is handled, into the way credit is given out and monitored, and so on and so forth. I see here a lost chance. This is this is a fund that is supposed to, in combination with private finance, to promote this, what they call just transition, the European Green Deal. But my own fear is that even this small, if you like, attempt, if limited attempt under capitalism to do something about climate change, it is going to be not only wasted, but diverted into uses and areas which have little to do with dealing with climate change. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. I see a danger there. This money being wasted, being taken up by the, those who are closer to the source of funding and being diverted into other uses, and therefore not even, this serving the narrow or kind of limited objective of the European Green Deal. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but this is the kind of risk that I see there. And I find it very disappointing, because even this is not very likely, well, not likely, it's not likely to produce the desired effects if we take the declared objectives and goals of the European Commission seriously, and assume that, yes, perhaps they could contribute this little bit to dealing with climate change and what that entails.
We can come back to that issue, but Marcella raised a finger, I think, or a whole hand, I'm not sure, but would you like to comment quickly?
Yeah, exactly. Also, I wanted to take up your question, of course, about the COVID-19 and the overall scenario. But first of all, allow me to answer to the question that it was put in the question and answer by Gemma. So obviously it's a very big question concerning the redesign of transports, I would say in general, or of urban landscape and so on. So obviously it would take too much time to discuss about the full issue. But basically I wanted to go back to what I said before. The transition to a carbon neutral economy, let's call it like that, is currently a technocratic project. And of course, it is considered in this way by the predominant economic paradigm and also by the European Commission. Vice versa, as I said before, I'm personally, but I think all the group would be in favor of a bottom-up project involving, of course, a democratic perspective, which of course refers also to the use of the money, as Marika was rightly saying. There is a need to surveillance of how this money will be allocated and spent. So just to give you an example, in Italy, that is, of course, one of the countries that has been hit hardly by the pandemic, especially in the richer part of the country, so in the north. Obviously, there is an enormous need of redesigning the urban landscape, the transports, but first of all, in order to catch up with the needs of the people. And again, in the simple example that I made before, for example, when we speak about transports, we usually ignore the gender of the people involved in the transport system, and vice versa. And this goes back also to what Joachim was mentioning before. The needs, for example, of women and men are absolutely different. The needs of elderly people and young people are totally different. The needs of migrant people that, by the way, use the public transport probably more than everybody else are still different. So in that sense, it's not only a problem of allocating the money in the right direction to serve, of course, to force this right direction as well with the bottom-up approach, which involves, of course, also an exercise in terms of mobilization of people, but also taking into account the different needs. And by the way, going back also to what Joachim was saying, this means, first of all, to redefine the paradigm in terms of consumer needs and consumer theory. We still base our theories on the paradigm that we are all the same, and basically we are all male consumers, white, which is totally wrong. It's just wrong. I mean, it's just wrong. There's no reasons to accept such a paradigm. So in order to take the opportunity of using crisis, and you know, and Marika can explain us very well that crisis in the ancient Greek means opportunity, by the way. So if we want to take up this opportunity, so then we have to change actually our point of view. I hope I also answered to your question, Jeremy. But in any case, obviously, I invite, first of all, Joachim to take part to our panel, and Jeremy already promised. So we will go back to this.
Well, I think we can open it up to the general audience. We've had a number of queries. Some of them have been answered, but there is another listener called Mechet Devrim. Mechet Devrim, are you there? And if so, can you unmute? He might have disappeared from the conference. I don't know.
Well, Jeremy, I think he's not with us anymore.
He's not with us.
He was the first to flag a hand, but I think he left the webinar.
Oh, not frustrated by the fact that we hadn't addressed his question immediately. So Joachim has raised a hand. Could others who up until now been passive participants, could they signal an intention to ask a question or to simply comment? So, but Joachim, would you like to?
I just want to come to the question you began to pronounce but didn't really finish. About the role of COVID, and together with the question about capitalism. My impression is that we shouldn't write off capitalism too easily. It's a very resilient beast, but what I think what we are seeing is the death of the current formation of capitalism. The current formation of the 2010s doesn't work anymore. It has been proven unworkable. The result will be, I think, a new kind of formation of capitalism, which is just emerging. It is not yet fixed contours, but it will be based on some COVID experience, like the necessity of state interventions and the state as a final guarantor of economic stability. What is essential jobs? I have never heard that any Wall Street people were mentioned in the list of essential jobs. The role of public debt, the need for social security. This is all elements which came to prominence during the COVID crisis, and we should push a bit to make them part of the emerging new formation of capitalism, because that probably is a condition for the intention to go a step further later on. So we will not get rid of capitalism, but as Emma Altvater said, we will see the end of capitalism as we know it. And we must make sure that we put our fingerprints on the next emergent version so that it has some open back doors for further positive developments. That combines these two questions. Thank you.
Okay. In the absence of any other requests to raise a hand or comment, I wonder if I could come back to the question of the compatibility of capitalism of any shape with a green transformation. I mean, it did strike me that in capitalism in its financialized form is a complete obstacle to the realization of a Green New Deal. And that has to be fundamentally disabled as an absolute precondition for any progress. And financial services, as a result, have to be recast in their proper service function rather than in their separate, decoupled existence within a global casino, which diverts so much in the way of global capital resources. It will be interesting to elaborate a bit on the whole issue of the sufficiency of resources being offered within the European Green Deal. Having looked at other proposals, notably those of Anne Pettifor and Varoufakis and Sven Giegold, as the representative of the Greens in the European Parliament, is quite clear that there are big differences in terms of both the scale and the modalities of financing the Green New Deal, of financing this radical transition. And to my mind, 100 billion is utterly insufficient. Varoufakis talks about 500 billion euros annually, which strikes me as being slightly closer to the deal. But I would welcome comments from the panelists, basically, in terms of both the scale, the modalities. Sorry, three points: the scale of the financial task and the modalities of getting to the transition, as well as the time scale. One of the main controversies of the recent years and months has been the contrast between the more sanguine approach of European Union and the United Nations and the more urgent approach of organizations like Extinction Rebellion. I mean, I have to say, I tend towards the urgency articulated by Extinction Rebellion. But could I ask for a response on those issues? Marcella, you've revealed yourself, so to speak, on the screen. Have you got anything to? to say. You need to unmute yourself, though.
No, actually, it was Marika who wanted to speak first. I would like to give her the floor, first of all.
Okay.
Thank you, Marcella. The thing is, you say capitalism under its present financialized mode and green transformation, whether the two can go together. And Joachim just a little while ago said that the capitalism is adaptable and adapting, but the form of capitalism is changing. I have reservations on both. I think that during this crisis, the COVID crisis, what I would expect to see is the emergence of public banks, publicly owned, state-owned banks, and that will be because a number of large financial institutions may well fail and have to be taken over by the state, or they may have to merge to achieve a large size and have state support. At the same time, I would expect to see development banks, that's already happening, being sort of either put together or becoming active in terms of handling recovery, the public money from the recovery fund and other funds being set up. Also, another trend would be for the creation of bad banks, that is, banks that take off the non-performing loans from the private banks and deal with them. So the banking, and I'm basically referring to the banking area, the banking system is about to change, will be changing, to my mind, in my sort of own perception. I may be wrong, but this is what I expect to see happening in the next few years, and not very long time from now. Is this a structural change? Well, it is a structural change, but I am not at all certain that when things quieten down, when the COVID crisis is dealt with in terms of the vaccine being found and tested and used, and therefore, you know, we relax that we're over this COVID crisis, then a reversal of trends may well take place. This is what, to a certain extent, this is what we went through during the financial crisis. The financial crisis went on for some like 10 years in a country like Greece, for a shorter period of time in other parts of Europe, or in other parts of the advanced, so-called advanced countries. So I would not be surprised if we witness a reversal of trends going forward past the crisis. So one needs to keep close sort of watch, have clear objectives and direction ahead of us, and see how and at which point and how we can intervene so as to channel change in the direction that we would want, sort of a progressive democratic direction. This is one comment that I would like to offer in the discussion. Now, on the scale, Jeremy, that you mentioned, according to these are the figures of the European Commission. That's a graph from the communication brought out, published early this year, and they're talking about at least, and at least is their own word, 1 trillion, which comes from the budget, it comes from leveraging private funds, it comes from redirecting money from other funds, and so on and so forth. We talked about this in Brussels just before the lockdown, when we had our public event as a Euro memo. So I mean, it would be, if you were to challenge the 100 billion, I think, of the Just Transition Fund, they would be ready to say, yes, of course, but we're talking about 1 trillion. The trap is, how do you get to 1 trillion? If it's just a matter of, you know, arranging your little boxes on a graph, yes, you can get anywhere you like. But if it's a question of actually influencing the way things work and making sure that you get money from taxation without, from where the money is, that is the wealthier part of the population, and a tax system that directs funds, resources from the wealthy to the poorer areas and within and across countries. And we're talking about public investment, that's fine. We're talking about leveraging private finance, that's fine as far as I'm concerned. But are you sure you're going to succeed? Are you sure you're going to A, be able to do it, and B, once you've done it, that it will go to the right uses?
So
I shan't go further because I could go on, longer, and that's not right.
any other comments? I have to say, I am very dubious. I'm very dubious about the potential for leveraging on the basis of a 100 billion euro input, given the relative failure of the big investment plan that was launched at the beginning of the last decade. They had fanciful multiplier statistics, which suggested something like, was it 15 times the original stimulus from the Commission. Does anybody have another comment?
May I say something about the mobilization of private capital? The two biggest waves of private investment we had in Germany over the last 50 years. One was when the government introduced strict regulations on the sulfur and nitrogen emissions from industrial production facilities of all kinds. This forced the private sector to invest hundreds of millions of euros to meet the standards. So that is why I'm advocating that regulation is a means to mobilize private capital by enforced investment, which is, I think, something which saves a lot of public money going that way. The most difficult point in that strategy, from my point of view, is the investor protection regulations in international trade agreements, which are a pain in the ass. The second biggest thing was we have a lot of rich people, or at least moderately rich people, middle-class people, who have some money to spend. So the second biggest investment of private capital was the renewable energies, when it was opened up for people to set up energy cooperatives and things like that. It was about, in about a year, it was 4 billion euro mobilized from savings accounts to be invested into renewable energies. So if people had the chance to do that bottom up from the grassroots, making sure that the benefits do not flow to some company headquarters, but to the local community, making the kindergarten cheaper or whatever, then there was a high willingness to invest, and that was a huge chunk of money. So I think these are avenues to mobilize private capital, which are completely ignored in the current European Green Deal. And this is things people like us could try to put on the agenda. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may add, actually Joachim said something that I wanted to say. So I totally agree with him about this type of social multiplier, let's call it like that, related also to social investments. And I just want to add maybe a minor point, but it's not so minor, is that apart from the scale of the intervention, the type of intervention and so on, we also must think very clearly about the methodology of the intervention. So I'm definitely in favor of a process of democratizing money. You know, certainly the book Banking to the People. that has become quite an important source of debate about also the use of digital money. So in that sense, we might invent new ways of interacting with money, especially in giving this money to people and asking them to become part of the game. In any case, what the COVID-19 has shown very clearly is that we need to establish a different type of economy, which is based on relationship and become more and more democratic. Otherwise, the risk of a crisis like the COVID-19 is just that the process of the decision-making process become more and more vertical, more and more autocratic, and this is something that we have to fight against.
Right. I wonder if we could perhaps move towards wrapping up the debate now, given the absence. So there is one chat I think I've just noticed on my menu bar. No, it's not. It's been answered. Could we wrap up? And I could ask all four participants to address the broader issue of the sort of bottom-up approach, the mobilization of civil society as a precondition for any kind of realization of a Green New Deal. Without that mobilization, I think it's going to be extremely difficult to generalize the narrative about the virtue of the Green New Deal and the non-virtue of the status quo. I think that narrative has to address the abuse of global commons, the abuse of nature, in the way that humanity succeeded in addressing issues like smallpox. I think environmental degradation has to be seen somehow as just as evil and just as much an enemy as smallpox. We succeeded in getting rid of smallpox in general, and that I think is the challenge for us, particularly as an activist bottoms-up approach to the issue. Could I ask all four participants to respond? Could I ask Murat to respond in the first instance, please?
Sure. I'll keep this brief, partly also because my office building closes at 6 and I don't want to get locked in. Can this be? I mean, I guess I want to focus on the example of smallpox. We have dealt with smallpox, but hundreds and thousands of people die from lack of basic clean water and other treatable diseases. So can we deal with climate change, for example? We can. It is actually possible reasonably to switch to an electricity-based economy that's powered partly by wind and solar and nuclear, and transition by throwing massive amounts of money within 2 or 3 decades to something much less damaging to the climate. But what are the implications of this on the ground? Is this actually generally, we can save humanity as such from a climate disaster, but the switch to renewable energies, for example, in the tropics, hasn't necessarily been good for the people that live in these areas. Things like RED process, things like wind power generators in Mexico have actually displaced people, have actually made it harder for them to continue with their livelihood. So we could deal with one major dimension of the crisis, but as a systemic challenge, the environmental limits of growth, that's an entirely different thing. And how social movements target that. If European social movements try to make Europe livable for another 100 years, that is achievable. But I think the broader connections to the rest of the world, those I'm less optimistic about. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Joachim, would you like to say something?
As you know me, always. I think the first thing, when starting with your smallpox example, the purpose of government policies was to eradicate it. That has been the aim towards COVID in China, Korea, and some other countries, but nowhere in Europe. Our purpose and objective always has been bending the curve, not overpowering the healthcare system, but that means not going to a virtual zero in the occurrence of the virus, but keeping it to a limited level. And that means that the measures which have been introduced, like social distancing, will need to remain in place as long as the virus is around, because from all that we know, there is not to be expected a full protection based on vaccination, because there will be different vaccines for different purposes with different effects, but a full vaccination of the whole population is very improbable. If that is the case, if these kinds of measures are still in place in 2 or 3 years' time, what do we imagine what that means for the future of labor, for the future of work? There will be different ways of working. There will be new definitions of what is a good work-life balance. There will be new tensions and conflicts between the white-collar workers who can work from remote and those who have to put their life on risk by working just on the assembly line or in the shop. So that is still something which we have not fully thought through. A third of all office buildings might be obsolete and could be turned into flats. The existing buildings have to be redesigned to allow for distancing. The kind of air control, the heating and cooling systems have to make sure that they're not distributing viruses as it has been happening in the meat industry, but they just take the air from the outside, reconstruction. So I think that the whole field of what this really would mean is a very open one. Nobody has really a final view on that. What does continued distancing mean for social networks? What does that mean for the social cohesion between people, in families, between neighborhoods, and so forth? So I think we are facing serious disruptions which are only slowly emerging. And in particular, given all these pressures on local networks, one of the most important things is the empowerment of decentralized organizations and structures. We need a devolved capacities down to the local level, city level, and even sub-city level. We need the right for participation in whatever form. If it's participation online, we must be aware that every inclusion is also an exclusion of other people. So that is a very delicate balance to strike. And one of the most positive things which I saw in our context in the last half year was that this need for more participation was clearly recognized by most environmental NGOs, but they also recognized one more thing, that it's not just administration processes, but they said that democracy cannot end at factory doors, and we're supporting trade union efforts to increase the co-decision in the company. So I think this is what I mean with coalitions growing together. You don't have one counterforce, but there is different groups which are discovering more and more in the COVID crisis that you cannot divide health, environment, social security, good life, and democratic participative society. And the more people understand that, the more powerful will be the pressure for a different kind of societal constellations.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to have to wrap it up very soon, unless Marika and Marcella have got a very brief final comment to make. Yes, Marcella? Marcella?
Yes, the final comment is that, well, first of all, I really think it was an excellent plenary. We discussed a lot of crucial issues for the coming days and coming plenaries and panels. But I think at the same time, and this is something that we've been discussing in previous conferences and certainly among the members of the steering committee, we need to become more open to contact with other networks in order to address issues like this. So, for example, I think it would be crucial in order to find a bottom-up approach shared with other actors to have a confrontation with the Forum for Transformative Economies that unfortunately couldn't meet in presence in Barcelona, but is still going on, the work everywhere, including also Italy. So in that sense, I think we need to be open to a confrontation with other network of activists and thinkers, and in that sense, we can learn a lot from each other.
All right, thank you. Marika, quickly. Murat has already disappeared to avoid his particular lockdown. So, but Marika, a very quick comment, perhaps.
Very quickly, yes. Bottom-up approach. We saw it happening during the financial crisis, especially in Greece. What Murat talked about, and Joachim, the circular economy. People became aware of the fact that their goods, their clothes, what they had could have a further use by somebody else. There were second-hand shops opening up, and so during the COVID crisis, also during the financial crisis, people adjusted their eating patterns when they went out to a taverna and so on, ordering less food and taking away what they hadn't eaten, taking it back with them. So in other words, and right now, for example, during the COVID crisis, the digital means of payment, of working have increased tremendously. So what I'm saying is, when you have what you can call disruptions, suddenly you have drastic events that make you aware of different way of doing what you've always done, then you adjust. You have to adjust, you do adjust, and you incorporate into your way of life. And this is a bottom-up approach. It starts from below. However, I would thoroughly agree with Marcella in her last comment. That is, the Euro member group needs to reach out to other sort of groups and movements, the unions, to see how we can get organized and help and support build this bottom-up approach on issues that are not necessarily, I mean, COVID is one such major crisis. More things are going to follow, and we need to prepare. During the financial crisis, we felt that so many economists were suddenly working on issues that we had been working for a decade or more. But this time, it is we can in the area of climate change, we can and should seek out other groups and work with them, because there is a lot of work to be done in order to help steer this approach to a progressive democratic direction. Thank you so much for inviting me, and that was a very interesting panel.
Well, thank you to whomever is still there online. Thank you for participating. Thank you for listening. To Joachim, who still is there, I understand. Many thanks for your very valuable contribution and your responses to probing questions. Marcella and Marika, you did a fantastic job leaping into the breach left by the absent contributor. I'd particularly like to thank Jonas Nitschke, who has been masterminding the technical issues behind this. Jonas is our new administrative executive, so to speak, and he has his handle on very many issues which are absolutely vital for the conduct of the Euromemo group. So thank you, Jonas, and thank you everybody else for participating.
Thank you, Jeremy, for your moderation. It was great.
Okay, thank you, Joachim.
For inviting us. Yeah.
I look forward to sharing a drink sometime, somewhere, and not socially distanced. There you go. All right.
With the screen. So.
All the best.
Thanks, everyone.